My husband walked out while I was standing at the register preparing to pay for his sister's $12,000 custom wedding gown. "Just going to pull the car around," he said with a bright smile, patting my shoulder gently. "Give me a few minutes." I waited while the minutes ticked by into silence. Then the store manager looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and dread before leaning in to whisper that I needed to step into the back office immediately. "My name is Bethany. I am 33 years old, and until that chilly Saturday afternoon in downtown Chicago, I thought I understood exactly what my marriage was. I thought I was simply the quiet and hardworking data analyst supporting a charming, charismatic husband. I had no idea that my entire life was a carefully constructed financial trap." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been manipulated by someone you trusted completely and had to fight your way out of the dark. The morning began like any other stressful weekend obligation in the Blackwell family. My sister-in-law Crystal was getting married, and the entire event had spiraled into an extravagant display of wealth that nobody in her family actually possessed. For weeks, Carter had been applying a steady, relentless pressure on me regarding her wedding dress. He insisted that as her older brother, it was his absolute duty to provide the perfect gown. But since I was the one with the steady income and the meticulous savings account, his noble duty quickly became my financial burden. I had spent years working long hours crunching numbers, organizing databases, and living frugally to build a solid safety net. Carter always called me his sensible rock. He framed this massive expense as a temporary family loan. He promised he would pay me back the moment his new business partnership came through at the logistics firm where he worked. I wanted to be the supportive wife. I wanted to prove that I belonged in his family. His mother and sister had always viewed my practical nature as somehow inferior to their grand ambitions. They lived for appearances, and I lived for stability. This dress was supposed to be my peace offering to them. The bridal boutique on the Magnificent Mile was a temple of excess designed to separate people from their money. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, flattering glow over racks of imported silk hand-sewn lace and delicate beadwork. Women in designer clothes sipped complimentary champagne from tall, fluted glasses, while assistants fluttered around them carrying trains and veils. I felt entirely out of place in my simple tailored work slacks and sensible flats. Crystal was standing on a circular velvet pedestal, admiring her reflection in a massive three-way mirror. The dress was a sprawling creation of beaded tulle and structured satin that looked heavy enough to drag her to the floor. It was undeniably beautiful, but the $12,000 price tag made my chest tight with a very specific kind of financial anxiety. That amount represented months of strict budgeting, skipped vacations, and careful planning. Carter stood beside the pedestal holding a glass of champagne and beaming at his sister. He looked like the proud, wealthy provider. He played the role perfectly, charming the sales associates, making them laugh, and making grand statements about how his little sister deserved nothing but the absolute best for her special day. Watching him, I felt a brief surge of affection suppressing the tiny voice of doubt in my head. When Crystal finally stepped down from the pedestal to change back into her street clothes, Joanne, the store manager, escorted Carter and me to the polished marble checkout counter. Joanne was a sharply dressed woman who radiated an aura of quiet efficiency. She began typing the invoice details into the computer system. My palms were sweating. I pulled my premium joint credit card from my wallet. It was a card tied directly to the savings I had built before our marriage, but had foolishly converted into a joint account at Carter's insistence last year. He had argued that married couples should share everything to build true trust. I held the heavy metal card in my hand, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. $12,000 was a massive hit to my security. Just as Joanne printed the final itemized receipt, Carter's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and his brow furrowed in a display of mild annoyance. He quickly typed a response before sliding the phone back into his tailored jacket. He turned to me with his signature charming smile, the one that always made me feel like I was the center of his world. "Just going to pull the car around to the front," he said lightly, resting his hand on my shoulder for a brief, comforting squeeze. "Traffic is terrible out there, and I do not want Crystal walking blocks in the cold. Give me a few minutes. Go ahead and take care of the invoice, and I will be right outside." He did not wait for my response. He turned and walked out the heavy glass doors of the boutique, disappearing into the busy Chicago street. I stood at the cool marble counter, forcing a polite smile at Joanne. "Take your time," I told her, adjusting the strap of my purse. "My husband is just getting the car." Joanne smiled back and continued preparing the thick garment bag, folding the dress with practiced care, and organizing the final paperwork in a branded folder. I watched the digital clock on the payment terminal. 5 minutes passed. I assumed Carter was just caught at a long traffic light or navigating the tricky one-way streets of the downtown grid, which were always a nightmare on weekends. 10 minutes passed. Crystal emerged from the fitting room dressed in her stylish winter coat, scrolling on her phone and looking completely unbothered by the wait. I pulled out my own phone and sent Carter a quick text asking if he was close to the front doors. There was no reply. I checked the read receipt, but the message simply sat there, delivered but ignored. 15 minutes went by. The polite smile on my face began to feel stiff and unnatural. Other customers were approaching the register area, and I was acutely aware that I was taking up space. Joanne offered me another glass of sparkling water, which I accepted simply to have something to do with my hands. 20 minutes. The anxiety in my chest shifted into a cold, prickling dread. Carter was never this late without calling. I tried dialing his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Crystal sighed loudly, complaining about the temperature in the store and wondering what was taking her brother so long. Joanne gently tapped the marble counter to get my attention. "Whenever you are ready, Mom, we can process the payment," she said, her tone perfectly professional, but carrying a hint of impatience. I apologized for the delay and handed her the heavy metal credit card. "It is fine," I told myself, taking a deep breath to calm my nerves. "He is just stuck in traffic or dealing with a stubborn parking attendant. I will pay, and we can wait by the door where it is warm." Joanne inserted the card into the terminal. I watched the small screen, waiting for the familiar approved message that would finalize the transaction and empty a huge portion of my savings. Instead, the machine emitted a loud, aggressive beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message that glared under the boutique lights. Joanne frowned slightly and pulled the card out, wiping the chip on her tailored sleeve before trying again. The same loud beep echoed through the quiet boutique, drawing the curious eyes of two wealthy women standing nearby. I felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up my neck, burning my cheeks. "I am so sorry," I said quickly, my voice tight with embarrassment. "There must be some kind of security hold because of the unusually large amount. My bank is very strict about fraud protection. Let me just pull up my banking app and clear the hold." I reached for my phone, intending to authorize the large purchase through my banking security settings. But before I could unlock my screen, Joanne looked at the terminal monitor behind her counter. Her professional demeanor slipped. The polite customer service smile vanished, completely replaced by a look of profound, genuine pity. It was the kind of look you give someone who has just experienced a tragedy they do not yet comprehend. She glanced nervously at Crystal, who was still distracted by her phone, then leaned across the wide marble counter, bringing her face close to mine. "Ma'am," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft classical music playing in the store. "Please come with me to the back office right now." I stared at her, completely confused. "Is there a problem with the chip?" I asked, trying to keep my own voice low. "I have another card in my wallet." Joanne gently placed her hand over mine, stopping me from opening my purse. "It is not an insufficient funds issue," she whispered, her eyes full of sorrow. "The merchant terminal provides specific codes for declined transactions. Your card issuer flagged this account and locked it down." I stood frozen, the beautiful boutique suddenly feeling like a massive cage. Flagged for what? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Joanne looked around one more time to ensure no one was listening. "The bank locked the account because the primary account holder reported this exact card stolen 10 minutes ago," she said softly. I followed Joanne on unsteady legs as she gently guided me away from the bright lights of the marble counter and down a short, narrow hallway. The plush, cream-colored carpet felt like quicksand beneath my sensible flats, dragging at my feet with every step. We stepped into a small, windowless office, tucked discreetly behind the stockroom. Joanne closed the heavy wooden door, shutting out the soft classical music and the cheerful murmur of wealthy shoppers out on the sales floor. The silence in the small room was immediate and deafening. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped my leather purse onto the small glass desk. Stolen. The word echoed in my mind, refusing to make any logical sense. Carter had not reported the card stolen. He had just patted my shoulder 10 minutes ago. He was pulling the car around to the front. There had to be a mistake. It had to be a massive, terrifying bank error. I thanked Joanne for her discretion, my voice sounding completely hollow and strange to my own ears. I assured her I would sort it out with my bank immediately. She gave me one last long look of deep sympathy before stepping out of the office, pulling the door shut to give me privacy. Left alone in the quiet office, I fumbled with my phone. The facial recognition software failed twice because my hands were trembling too much to hold the device steady. I finally typed in my passcode with clumsy fingers and tapped the bright blue icon of my banking app. The circular loading screen seemed to spin for an absolute eternity. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told myself it was just a security glitch. A temporary freeze on the card because of the unusually large $12,000 charge at a bridal boutique. That was all it was. Then the dashboard loaded. The numbers on the screen did not make sense. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again, praying the digital display would correct itself. It did not. The joint checking account which held our monthly operating expenses and the funds for our mortgage payment read exactly $0.00. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck, plastering my hair to my skin. I quickly tapped the tab for the joint savings account. This was the account where I had deposited my entire life savings. 5 years of grueling corporate work, skipping lunches, putting off buying new clothes, and working late into the night. It was my safety net, my future, and supposedly our financial foundation to eventually start a family. That balance also stared back at me with absolute brutal finality. $0.00. The transaction history showed a single massive wire transfer initiated less than 20 minutes ago, draining every single penny to an external account I did not recognize. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, agonizing rush. I slumped into the small swivel chair by the desk, clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. It was not a bank error, it was a calculated strike. Just as the terrifying reality of my empty accounts began to suffocate me, the phone vibrated harshly in my palm. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was Carter. I stared at his name, the name of the man who had just smiled at me and promised to bring the car around. My thumb hovered over the notification before I finally pressed it. The message was cold, mechanical, and utterly devoid of the charm he used to win me over. I am done pretending, the text read. I took what is mine. You can figure out how to pay for your own ride home. Do not bother calling. I read the short paragraph over and over again, my brain struggling to process the cruelty. I took what is mine. He had taken everything. Every dollar I had earned, every ounce of security I had built. And he had left me stranded in a high-end bridal shop with a $12,000 invoice I was supposed to pay for his sister. He knew exactly what he was doing. He timed it perfectly, leaving me to face the ultimate humiliation while he drove away with my life savings. I sat in that back office for what felt like hours. The initial shock gave way to a sickening wave of intense shame. I had to go back out there. I had to face the store manager and I had to face Crystal. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and smoothed my work slacks. I opened the door and walked back down the plush hallway. Joanne was waiting discreetly near the register, her hands clasped in front of her. I walked up to her, my face burning. I am so sorry, I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. I cannot pay for the dress today. There has been a family emergency. Joanne nodded softly, her eyes full of that same agonizing pity. She slid the heavy metal credit card back across the marble counter. I took it, sliding the useless piece of plastic back into my wallet. Crystal was standing near the front doors, tapping her boot impatiently. "Well," she snapped as I approached her. "Did you pay for it? The tailor needs to start the custom alterations by Tuesday." I looked at my sister-in-law, feeling completely stripped of my dignity. "I cannot cover the dress, Crystal," I said, my voice trembling. "Carter just left. He took the car and our accounts are empty." Crystal let out a dramatic sigh. "Seriously, Bethany," she groaned, rolling her eyes. "You two are fighting now. You are literally ruining my wedding vibes. Carter promised me that dress. You need to figure this out and fix it before Mom finds out." I did not have the energy to argue or explain the magnitude of what her brother had just done. I pushed past her and opened the glass doors of the boutique, stepping out into the freezing wind. The freezing cold air hit my face like a physical blow. I stood frozen on the busy sidewalk as shoppers hurried past me wrapped in thick winter scarves. I was totally stranded in the middle of the city. I pulled out my phone and checked my personal digital wallet app. I had exactly $34 linked to an old separate debit card I rarely used. It was barely enough for a rideshare home to the suburbs. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for Carter's cruelty. Surely his family did not know he was doing this. His mother, Linda, was the matriarch who kept everyone in line. She prided herself on family reputation, appearances, and traditional values. If I called her, she would demand Carter return the money. She would fix this misunderstanding. With shaking fingers, I pulled up Linda's contact and hit the call button, holding the phone to my ear. The line rang twice in my ear before she finally answered. I prepared to beg for help, to explain that her son had just abandoned me at a register and stolen our life savings. I had absolutely no idea that the profound betrayal I was about to uncover ran much deeper than a single devastating text message from my husband. "Hello," Linda answered on the second ring, her tone brisk and slightly irritated, as if I had interrupted her during something highly important. "Linda." I gasped, my voice cracking in the freezing wind. "It is Carter. He left me stranded at the bridal boutique. He took my credit card and drained our entire joint checking and savings accounts to zero. He sent a text saying he took what is his. You have to talk to him. Something is horribly wrong." I waited for the gasp of shock. I waited for the maternal outrage, for the immediate promise that she would call her son and demand he stop this madness. Instead, a long, heavy sigh came through the receiver. "Well, Bethany," Linda said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth, "I cannot say I am completely surprised." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, staring at the screen to make sure I had dialed the right number. Surprised, I stammered, gripping the device tighter. "Linda, he stole $80,000. My life savings. He left me with nothing. He took what he was entitled to." Linda corrected sharply, smoothly gliding over the accusation of theft. "Honestly, Bethany, if you were not constantly staring at your spreadsheets and acting like a boring number cruncher, maybe a man like Carter would not have felt so suffocated in his own marriage. You can hardly blame him for needing to breathe." The icy pavement beneath my feet felt like it was tilting. Suffocated, I repeated the word, barely managing to squeeze past the tight knot in my throat. "I work 60-hour weeks so he can lease a new car every 2 years. I paid the down payment on our house. I was literally standing in a store trying to pay $12,000 for the wedding dress of your daughter because he asked me to." "And you are throwing it in my face," Linda countered smoothly, twisting the narrative with practiced ease. "This is exactly what Carter means. You are always keeping score. You treat our family like a balance sheet instead of embracing us. A marriage requires warmth, Bethany. It requires passion and social grace. You sit in the corner at our dinner parties talking about data trends while Carter tries to entertain our guests. You have always been a social liability. Take an Uber home for the sake of heaven and stop being so dramatic. You can figure out your own transportation." She did not hang up immediately. She stayed on the line, letting her cruel assessment hang in the bitter Chicago air. In that chilling silence, the puzzle pieces finally snapped together. The missing money, the perfectly timed exit, the casual cruelty of Crystal earlier. Linda was not shocked, because Linda already knew. They all knew. You planned this with him, I whispered, the horror washing over me in cold, sickening waves. You knew he was going to empty the accounts today. Carter is my son, Linda, stated, her tone shifting from dismissive to fiercely protective. He deserves a life with someone who actually understands how to be a partner, someone who fits into our circles. We are just supporting his happiness. Now please stop calling. We have a wedding to focus on. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, listening to the dull, repetitive tone of the disconnected call. The bustling street around me faded into a muffled blur. Shoppers bumped my shoulders as they hurried past, carrying bags of designer clothes and luxury goods, but I could not feel the impacts. I was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. It was not just my husband who had deceived me. The entire family had conspired to bleed me dry and discard me when they were finished. For 7 years, I had desperately tried to earn the approval of Linda. I had hosted their holiday dinners, carefully selecting menus that accommodated the absurd dietary restrictions of everyone. I had purchased lavish gifts for the birthdays of Crystal to show I cared. I had paid for family vacations, pretending not to notice when the parents of Carter requested premium upgrades on my dime. I had swallowed my own discomfort in loud, crowded social settings just to stand by his side and be the supportive wife. And the entire time they had viewed me not as family, but as a human cash machine. I was the dull, hard-working scapegoat whose only purpose was to fund the lifestyle of their golden child. Carter could bounce from one failed business venture to another, rack up credit card debt on expensive golf clubs, and ignore his responsibilities, and his mother would simply smile and call him a free spirit. Meanwhile, my late nights at the office building predictive models and securing our financial future were branded as boring and cold. A sharp gust of wind bit through my thin wool coat, snapping me out of my paralyzing shock. The physical discomfort served as a harsh reminder of my immediate reality. I was standing on Michigan Avenue, freezing, completely alone and financially ruined. I could not stand on the pavement crying over a family that had never loved me. The grief would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. I opened my digital wallet app again, staring at the meager $34 balance linked to my old forgotten debit card. It was a pathetic remnant of financial independence, but it was the only lifeline I had left. My fingers were so numb from the cold that I could barely type my home address into the rideshare application. The estimated fare popped up on the screen reading $28.50. I hit confirm, praying the transaction would process before the bank caught wind of whatever Carter had done to the primary accounts. A wave of intense anxiety washed over me as I watched the small digital car icon crawl across the map toward my location. My mind shifted rapidly from the empty bank accounts to the physical contents of my home. If Carter and his mother had planned this financial ambush so meticulously, what else had they prepared to take from me? My birth certificate, my passport, my tax documents, and most importantly, the encrypted backup hard drives for my work. Those drives held the proprietary data models I had spent 5 years coding in secret, late at night when Carter was asleep or out drinking with his friends. They were my actual life work, representing thousands of hours of complex, algorithmic programming that nobody in his social circle knew about. If he realized their value or simply decided to destroy them out of spite, I would lose far more than just my savings account. I needed to get back to the suburbs immediately to secure my private documents before he could inflict any more damage. The silver sedan pulled up, splashing the slush onto my cold ankles. I climbed into the back seat, pulling my heavy coat tightly around my shoulders, shivering violently as warm air hit my frozen skin. The driver navigated the familiar winding streets of our quiet subdivision, passing manicured lawns and stately brick houses. We turned onto my street and my breath caught. A massive white moving truck was parked at the end of my driveway, pulling slowly away from my very own house, right before my terrified eyes. I scrambled out of the car, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The taillights of the moving truck disappeared around the corner, taking pieces of my life with it. I ran up the long paved driveway, my breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. I fumbled in my purse, pulling out my keychain with trembling fingers. I slid the familiar brass key into the deadbolt and tried to turn it. The metal jammed. It did not budge a single millimeter. I pulled the key out and tried again, pushing harder, attempting to force the mechanism to yield. It was useless. The lock casing was bright and shiny, completely brand new. They had changed the locks. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I was locked out of the home I had financed, the home I maintained, while Carter spent his weekends at the golf course. The absolute panic over my encrypted hard drives spiked sharply in my chest. If they had taken my work, my entire future would be completely erased forever. I took a step back from the door, forcing myself to breathe deeply. They thought they had sealed me out, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. 7 months ago, Carter had lost his keys, locking us out. I had hired a locksmith the very next day and quietly asked him to install a secondary hidden bypass code on the garage keypad. I never told Carter. I hurried down the front steps and practically sprinted to the side of the garage. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but I punched the secret sequence of numbers into the discreet digital panel hidden behind the decorative ivy trellis. A small green light flashed, and the heavy metal garage door began to rumble upward. I did not wait for it to open completely. I dropped to my knees and rolled under the rising door, the rough concrete scraping against my slacks. I stood up in the dim light of the garage. Both parking spaces were entirely empty. I marched toward the interior door that led into the mudroom. This lock had not been changed. I turned the knob and stepped inside the house. The silence that greeted me was heavy and unnatural. My footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor as I walked out of the mudroom and into the main living area. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hands flying to my mouth. The entire house had been stripped bare. The custom leather sectional I had saved up for months to buy was gone. The vintage oak coffee table, the large flat-screen television, the woven area rugs, the bookshelves, everything had vanished. Even the artwork I had carefully selected from local galleries had been pulled from the walls. It was a complete and utter violation. They had dismantled my sanctuary in a matter of hours. As I stood in the center of the echoing living room, a soft, melodic clinking sound drifted down the hallway. It came from the kitchen. Then I smelled it, the unmistakable heavy scent of expensive floral perfume. I moved slowly toward the sound, my flats making no noise on the bare floorboards. I turned the corner into the expansive open-concept kitchen and stopped. Sitting casually at the massive white quartz island, bathed in the warm light of the pendant fixtures, were Linda and Crystal. They had not taken everything. They had left 2 of the tall velvet bar stools. Linda was sitting elegantly, sipping a glass of rich red wine. I recognized the bottle instantly. It was a rare vintage I had purchased 2 years ago to save for a special anniversary. Crystal sat next to her, scrolling lazily through her phone, a half-empty wine glass resting near her manicured hand. Neither of them looked the least bit surprised to see me. "Well, look who finally figured out how to get inside," Linda said smoothly, taking another delicate sip of my wine. "I told Carter it was foolish to underestimate your stubbornness, Bethany." I stared at them, feeling a cold, detached sensation settling over my skin. "Where is my husband?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "And where is all of my furniture?" Linda offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Carter is exactly where he belongs," she stated, her tone carrying a chilling authority. "He is securing his future. You see, Bethany, Carter has left you. He has moved on to a life that actually matches his potential." I walked slowly into the kitchen, keeping my distance from the island. He left me and stole my life savings. I countered, the anger finally beginning to crack through my shock. He drained the joint accounts and took the furniture I paid for. That is theft. Linda waved a perfectly manicured hand, dismissing my accusation as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "Please do not be so terribly dramatic," she sighed. "Carter simply took his fair share of the marital assets. He needs those resources to establish his new life with Vanessa." Vanessa. I repeated the name, tasting bitter and unfamiliar on my tongue. "Yes, Vanessa." Linda said, her eyes lighting up with genuine maternal pride that I had never once seen directed at me. "She is a vibrant, beautiful 24-year-old marketing executive. She is full of life and passion, and she adores my son. But more importantly, Bethany, she understands the corporate world. Her father is Richard, the chief executive officer of Apex Logistics." The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. Apex Logistics was the massive shipping conglomerate Carter had been obsessively talking about for the past 8 months. His entire career at his current struggling firm hinged on securing a lucrative partnership with Apex. He had spent countless evenings pacing our living rooms, stressing over how to land a meeting with the elusive executive board. Now the sickening reality of his strategy was laid bare right in front of me. He had not just secured a meeting. He had secured the daughter of the chief executive. He traded our marriage for a lucrative business deal. Linda scoffed, her expression hardening into a look of absolute contempt. "He upgraded his life," she corrected sharply. Before I could respond to the sheer magnitude of her cruelty, Crystal let out a loud, exasperated groan. "Honestly, Bethany," she chimed in, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance, "can you just stop making this entire situation about you? You are acting completely hysterical, and it is ruining my wedding vibes. I have a million things to do before the ceremony next week, and listening to your meltdown is not on my schedule." I turned to look at my sister-in-law, astonished by her profound lack of empathy. "Your brother just destroyed my life," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "He left me stranded with the bill for your wedding gown, and you are worried about your vibes." Crystal glared at me, folding her arms across her chest. "Carter already promised Vanessa my +1 for the reception," she stated casually, twisting the knife even deeper into my chest. "Honestly, Bethany, you have always been a massive social liability anyway. You never know how to talk to our friends. You cannot even hold on to your own husband. But we still expect you to cover the florist bill by Friday as promised, or my entire floral arrangement will be ruined and I will never forgive you." I stared at Crystal, trying to process the sheer audacity of her demand. I was standing in the hollowed-out shell of my home, entirely robbed of my savings, and she was genuinely concerned about centerpieces. "You are actually asking me to pay for your flowers?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Crystal let out a sharp bark of laughter, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I am not asking, Bethany. I am telling you. Carter already put the deposit down on your card before it was locked, and the final balance is due Friday. If it bounces, the florist walks. And frankly, after the way you have behaved today, it is the least you can do." She took a slow sip of her wine. Besides, she continued, her tone dripping with unearned superiority, "you will not even be there to enjoy the flowers anyway. Carter already promised your seat to Vanessa. It is a +1, and he needs her by his side." Crystal leaned back with a satisfied smile. "Vanessa is bringing her father and several Apex executives," she said. "Carter plans to discuss his partnership at the reception, and no one wants you there complicating the evening." The casual way she reduced my marriage to a networking inconvenience told me everything I needed to know. Linda set her wine glass down on the counter with a definitive click. "Crystal is right, Bethany," Linda stated, her voice smooth and practiced. "We are not telling you these things to be cruel. We are simply being realistic about the situation. You and Carter were always a mismatch. He is a rising star in the corporate world, and you are comfortable hiding behind a computer screen. It was never going to last, and deep down, I think you always knew that. Now that he has finally found someone who can match his ambition, we expect you to handle this separation with the dignity and quiet grace that you have failed to show thus far." I stood rooted to the hardwood floor, my hands slowly balling into fists at my sides. "Dignity." I repeated the word, tasting like ash. You helped your son steal $80,000 from me. You helped him strip my house bare while I was standing in a store trying to buy your daughter a dress. And you are lecturing me about dignity." Linda did not even flinch. She simply offered that same patronizing smile, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her designer skirt. That money was compensation for the years he wasted trying to build a life with someone who refused to grow with him, she replied smoothly. And let us be clear about what happens next. You are going to step aside quietly. You will accept an uncontested divorce. You will not contest the division of assets, and you will certainly not make any public spectacle of this transition. Carter is on the verge of securing a life-changing partnership with Richard and Apex Logistics. Vanessa is his key to that world. We cannot have a bitter, discarded ex-wife throwing tantrums and creating gossip that might reflect poorly on us in front of Vanessa and her wealthy parents. The sheer entitlement radiating from them was almost suffocating. They genuinely believed that my money, my home, and my silent obedience were simply their birthright. "You expect me to just walk away with nothing?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You expect me to just let him take everything I worked for while he plays house with a 24-year-old, down?" Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "We do not just expect it, Bethany. We demand it. And if you even think about causing a scene or making things difficult for Carter, we will absolutely destroy you." She let the threat hang in the air. "If you fight this uncontested divorce, or if you dare to speak a single word of this to anyone, we will make sure your professional reputation is completely ruined. We will tell everyone how unstable you became, how you were emotionally abusive and controlling to Carter. We will paint you as a bitter, hysterical woman who could not handle being replaced. Good luck maintaining your secure little corporate career when no respectable firm will touch you because of the terrible rumors we can easily spread and validate." I looked at Linda, absorbing the full magnitude of her threat. She was entirely serious. In her mind, I was nothing but a fragile, insignificant worker bee who could be easily squashed by their superior social standing. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. She assumed that because I avoided conflict, I was incapable of fighting back. I slowly turned my gaze away from her malicious face and looked around the kitchen. I looked at the bare walls where my favorite paintings used to hang. I looked at the empty spaces where the furniture I had carefully chosen and paid for once sat. I looked at the clean, pristine countertops of the home I had funded with my own sweat and exhaustion. I did not scream. I did not cry. The frantic, panicked heartbeat that had been hammering in my chest since I stood at the bridal boutique register suddenly slowed down, settling into a steady, rhythmic thrum. The overwhelming wave of shock and betrayal that had threatened to drown me completely evaporated. In its place, a profound, icy clarity began to take over my entire body. It was a cold, detached sensation that sharpened my senses and cleared my mind of all the lingering fog. I realized in that specific crystalline moment exactly who I was dealing with. They were not family. They were arrogant, entitled parasites who had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they had taken everything from me. They thought they had drained my resources and cornered me into complete and utter submission. They truly believed I was just a boring number cruncher who would retreat into the shadows and weep endlessly over a lost husband. But as I stood there, holding the gaze of the woman who was actively trying to destroy my life, I felt an overwhelming, undeniable sense of power rushing through my veins. It was the quiet, steady power of someone who knows a devastating secret. They had absolutely no idea what I had been doing during all those late nights they mocked me for. They had no idea about the massive corporate acquisition that had just completely revolutionized my financial existence. Carter thought he was clever stealing $80,000. He had no clue he was leaving behind a multi-million-dollar empire. They thought they held all the cards, but they did not even realize we were playing an entirely different game with stakes they could not possibly comprehend. I slowly looked back at Linda and Crystal. The silence in the kitchen stretched out heavy and absolute. I did not offer them the satisfaction of an argument. I did not give them the reaction they were so desperately craving. I simply stared at them, my face a perfectly calm, unreadable mask, while the blueprint of their absolute ruin began to form in my mind. Linda checked the gold watch on her wrist. "You have exactly 1 hour, Bethany," she announced, her voice slicing through the cold kitchen air like a razor. "1 hour to gather whatever cheap clothes you left behind. If you are not off this property by the time the minute hand reaches the top of the dial, I will personally call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I am sure they would respond quickly to an erratic woman refusing to vacate a private residence. Crystal nodded, taking a deliberate sip of my vintage wine. "Do not try to take anything else," Crystal added with a dismissive wave. "Carter already did a thorough inventory of the valuables. We know exactly what belongs here and what does not. Just grab your boring office sweaters and get out." I did not argue. I did not plead to keep the house my hard-earned money had secured. I gave them a slow nod, turned on my heel, and walked out of the kitchen. My footsteps echoed against the bare walls as I climbed the wooden staircase. The master bedroom door was wide open, revealing a completely barren space where our king-size bed used to sit. I walked past it without a second glance, heading straight for the small guest room at the far end of the hall. Carter had clearly tossed my remaining belongings in there. A few pairs of tailored work slacks, sensible button-down blouses, and my basic toiletries were piled carelessly on the bare mattress. I pulled a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the closet shelf. I folded my clothes methodically, taking my time to ensure every crease was perfectly aligned. I was not rushing or running away. I was executing a necessary task. I did not pack any items Carter had gifted me. I left the silver necklace from our first anniversary resting on the nightstand. I left the silk scarf he bought me in Paris draped over the door. I left the expensive perfume his mother gave me untouched on the dresser. I only packed the things I had purchased with my own money, the things representing my hard work, my quiet dedication, and my unyielding independence. It took exactly 22 minutes to fill the duffel bag and zip it firmly closed. I threw the heavy strap over my shoulder and walked back out into the hallway. The house felt incredibly cold, stripped of the warmth and the life I had tried to breathe into it. I walked down the stairs, gripping the wooden banister with a steady hand. From the bottom of the staircase, I could hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. They did not even look up as I crossed the empty living room. I walked straight to the front door, grasped the cold brass knob, and stepped outside onto the concrete porch. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me with a firm, definitive click. I did not look back. As my flat shoes hit the icy pavement of the driveway, my entire demeanor shifted. The defeated posture of the boring data analyst vanished. I stood up, perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back, and taking a deep breath of the freezing Chicago air. The terrified woman who had been stranded at the bridal boutique was gone. The quiet, accommodating wife who always apologized for taking up space no longer existed. I was alone holding a single bag of clothes, but I had never felt more powerful. I walked down the driveway and stopped near the curb. I reached into the main compartment of my leather purse. My everyday smartphone was sitting right on top. I bypassed it completely. Instead, I slid my fingers down to the very bottom of the bag, pressing against the thick leather lining. Months ago, I had carefully sliced a hidden compartment into the base of the purse, securing it with an invisible zipper. I pulled the zipper back and slipped my hand inside the concealed pocket. My fingers wrapped around a secondary device. It was a sleek black phone, heavily encrypted and virtually untraceable. Carter had never seen it. Linda did not know it existed. Nobody in their pretentious social circle could ever fathom that the quiet, boring wife possessed military-grade communication technology. I pulled the device out into the cold air. The screen illuminated instantly, requiring a 12-digit alphanumeric passcode to unlock. I bypassed the security protocols with rapid, practiced efficiency. The home screen was completely bare. It contained only highly secure communication channels and direct links to offshore financial networks. I opened the encrypted dialing application and typed in a private international number. The line was completely secure, bouncing through multiple proxy servers before connecting to an exclusive wealth management firm located thousands of miles away. It rang exactly twice before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. "Good afternoon, madam," the voice said respectfully. "We have been monitoring the designated channels. Are we proceeding with the primary directive today?" I looked back at the large brick house where my husband had just abandoned me. I looked at the drawn curtains where my mother-in-law was currently plotting my social demise. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face, warming the icy chill that had settled into my cheeks. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "Release the software sale proceeds into the holding company and complete the distressed logistics acquisition we discussed. Keep my beneficial ownership confidential until I authorize disclosure." "Understood, madam," the wealth manager said. "The due diligence is complete. We will execute the closing documents within the hour and maintain the existing management structure until you issue further instructions." I ended the call and slipped the encrypted device back into the hidden lining of my purse. I pulled my wool coat tightly around my shoulders and began walking down the suburban sidewalk to wait for my rideshare. The biting wind whipped my hair around my face, but I did not feel the cold anymore. My mind was already moving 10 steps ahead, calculating the exact trajectory of the avalanche I had just unleashed. As I walked away from the house, one thought steadied me. Their contempt had given me cover. They had mocked every late night and dismissed every hour I spent behind a computer, never curious enough to ask what I was actually building. Their ignorance was the only advantage they had left me, and I was finally ready to use it. To understand how I arrived at this moment, you have to understand what my life looked like when the sun went down and the house grew quiet. For years, Carter and his family had categorized me as a low-level data analyst. They pictured me mindlessly entering numbers into spreadsheets for a mediocre corporate salary. I let them believe that because it was the easiest way to avoid their constant scrutiny. The truth was, my day job was merely a stepping stone. During my hours at the office, I observed massive inefficiencies in how global supply chains operated. I saw millions of dollars being wasted daily due to poor predictive modeling and outdated logistics tracking. I knew I could build something better. So every night after serving dinner and listening to Carter complain about his demanding boss at his mid-level logistics firm, I would retreat to the small spare bedroom. I would boot up my custom-built computer and begin coding. I was developing a proprietary predictive analytics software specifically designed to revolutionize global supply chain management. It was incredibly complex work requiring intense focus and thousands of hours of rigorous testing. Carter never understood what I was doing, and he never cared to ask. On the rare occasions he actually walked into the spare bedroom, he would roll his eyes at the glowing monitors filled with lines of code. He called it my little coding hobby. He would stand in the doorway holding a beer and tell me I was wasting my time staring at a screen when I should be out socializing with his friends or keeping him company in the living room. He complained that my typing was too loud and that my hobby was a pathetic excuse to avoid my duties as a supportive wife. Whenever Linda came over for dinner, she would echo his sentiments. She would tell me that successful men like her son needed wives who were vibrant and engaging, not women who hid away in dark rooms playing on computers. Their constant belittling could have broken my spirit, but instead it fueled my determination. I realized very early on that if I ever succeeded, they would immediately try to claim my success as their own. So I took extreme precautions. I quietly established a stealth limited liability company using an out-of-state registered agent. I funneled my initial seed money, the small inheritance my grandmother had left me, entirely into this corporate entity. I registered every single line of code, every patent application, and every intellectual property right, strictly under the name of the LLC. Legally speaking, Bethany the Quiet Wife owned absolutely nothing. The corporate entity owned the future. As the years passed, my software evolved from a theoretical model into a fully functional powerhouse. I began running simulated logistics scenarios using real-world data, and the results were staggering. My predictive algorithms could forecast supply chain disruptions weeks before they happened, saving companies millions in potential losses. The efficiency of the code was entirely unmatched by anything currently available on the commercial market. Word of my technology began to spread quietly through the elite circles of the tech industry. I operated completely under the radar, taking confidential meetings via secure video links while Carter was out playing golf or having drinks with Vanessa. I negotiated with venture capitalists and tech giants, always representing myself as the chief executive officer of the holding company. None of them knew I was operating out of a suburban guest room. None of them knew my husband thought I was a boring data analyst. They only saw the brilliance of the software and the massive profit potential it represented. They viewed me as a highly sought-after visionary leader. The culmination of 5 years of secret work came 48 hours before Carter emptied our joint accounts. After months of negotiations, I signed the final agreement, selling my predictive analytics platform for $28 million. The proceeds were transferred directly into a corporate trust funded from my separate inheritance and protected by records that predated my marriage. None of the money ever touched our joint accounts. For several months, my advisors had also been negotiating through a blind holding company to purchase a distressed logistics business whose outdated systems could be rebuilt around my technology. The due diligence and legal documents were already complete. The sale of my software supplied the final capital, and the call I made outside the house authorized the acquisition to close. Carter had stolen the savings from my day job without realizing that my real wealth was already protected inside a corporate structure he did not know existed. This was the brilliant, devastating irony of my current situation. Carter had spent months meticulously planning his grand escape. He had secretly courted Vanessa to secure a partnership with her father. He had plotted with his mother and sister to humiliate me and force me out of our home. He had forged documents and drained our joint checking and savings accounts, taking the $80,000 I had saved from my day job. He genuinely believed he had left me destitute and completely broken. He thought he had taken my entire life savings and walked away the ultimate victor. He stole my pocket change, completely unaware that he was leaving behind a massive technological empire. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to appear wealthy that he failed to see the actual billionaire sitting quietly right across the dinner table. He traded a $28 million future for a leased car and a 24-year-old girl who only liked him because he pretended to be successful. His short-sighted greed had cost him everything he ever truly wanted. I walked slowly until I reached the busy intersection at the far edge of the neighborhood and watched my requested rideshare pull up directly to the curb. I climbed into the warm leather back seat and gave the professional driver the exact address of one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in downtown Chicago. I was done sleeping in small guest rooms and making myself small to accommodate the fragile egos of the Blackwell family. As the car sped away from the suburbs, I opened my encrypted phone again and began drafting a highly confidential email to a specialized legal team. I needed an attorney who understood corporate warfare and complex financial fraud. Carter mistakenly thought our divorce was going to be a simple, uncontested matter where I quietly disappeared into poverty. He expected me to cry and beg and ultimately surrender to the demands of his mother. But I was not going to surrender. I was going to mobilize a legal strike so precise and devastating that he would never recover. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city skyline approach in the distance. I had the money, I had the undeniable power, and I finally had the absolute tactical element of surprise on my side. The boring, quiet little number cruncher was truly dead forever. It was time to show Carter and his family exactly what happens when you try to destroy the person who secretly owns the entire board. I slowly took a deep, long breath of the warm air inside the vehicle, feeling now completely calm and ready for the battles that lay ahead. The rideshare pulled up to the grand entrance of the famous Langham Hotel, located in the heart of the city. A sharply dressed bellhop immediately opened the door, offering a white-gloved hand to assist me out of the vehicle. I stepped onto the pristine pavement, feeling the heavy mahogany doors of the lobby welcoming me into a world Carter could only dream of accessing. I walked directly to the VIP reception desk, bypassing the main line entirely. The concierge greeted me by the name of my corporate alias, a name I had spent years establishing in the upper echelons of the tech world. Within minutes, I was escorted to the penthouse suite on the top floor. The space was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago River and the sprawling city skyline. I dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the imported Italian leather sofa. The sheer luxury of the suite was a stark contrast to the barren, empty walls of the suburban house I had just left behind. It was quiet up here, far removed from the petty cruelty of Linda and Crystal. I walked into the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection. I did not look like a broken woman. I looked like someone who had survived a storm and was ready to become the hurricane. I ordered a pot of black coffee from room service and set up my encrypted laptop on the massive glass dining table. I did not have time to rest or mourn the end of a broken marriage. I had a war to win. Exactly 45 minutes later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet suite. I walked over and opened the heavy wooden door. Standing there was Diana. She was an absolute legend in the legal community, known for being a ruthless, high-powered attorney who specialized in dismantling financial fraud and destroying arrogant spouses. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit and carried a thick leather briefcase that looked like it held the ruined lives of 100 foolish men. Her eyes were sharp and observant, missing absolutely nothing as she stepped into the penthouse. She did not offer a warm hug or empty platitudes about how sorry she was for my heartbreak. She did not ask me how I was feeling emotionally. That was exactly why I had hired her. Diana dealt in facts, strategy, and absolute devastation. She set her heavy briefcase down on the glass table and took a seat across from me, pulling out a thick stack of crisp manila folders. "We are on the clock, Bethany," she said, her voice crisp and commanding. "I reviewed the preliminary data you sent from the car. Your husband is incredibly arrogant, but he is also remarkably sloppy. Let us dissect exactly how he managed to drain the accounts today." I poured us both a cup of the dark, rich coffee as Diana spread the financial documents across the glass surface. The paperwork detailed the exact timeline of the $80,000 theft. It was difficult to look at the numbers knowing those funds represented years of my quiet sacrifice, endless budgeting, and skipped lunches. Carter planned and timed it so perfectly, knowing I would be completely distracted by the massive $12,000 invoice. Diana traced her manicured finger down the list of transaction codes, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed the digital footprints he left behind in the banking system. She explained that transferring such a massive sum of money from a personal retail banking account typically triggers automatic security holds and severe daily transfer limits. The bank algorithms are specifically designed to prevent someone from emptying an entire life savings through a simple mobile application. Carter would not have been able to just swipe a button on his phone and steal $80,000 in one swift motion while walking to his car. He had to have bypassed the digital security measures manually beforehand. Diana pulled a specific sheet of paper from the bottom of her thick folder. She pushed it across the glass table toward me, tapping the bottom right corner with her pen. I requested a direct copy of the authorization form from the bank branch manager, she explained, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "Your husband definitely did not do this online. He went physically into the branch 2 days ago to set up a scheduled wire transfer for the exact moment he planned to leave you stranded. He bypassed the digital daily transfer limits by submitting a physical authorization document to a teller." I looked down at the paper. It was a standard wire transfer request form, bearing the official blue logo of our bank. The destination account was listed as a private trust under the name of Vanessa. Carter was not just leaving me for her, he was actively funding their new life together with my money. But it was the bottom of the form that made my blood run entirely cold. There on the signature line, right next to the scrawled name of my husband, was my own signature. It was an incredibly poor imitation of my handwriting. The loops were entirely wrong, the slant was off, and the pressure was uneven, but it was clearly a deliberate attempt to replicate my name. I stared at the forged ink, feeling a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. "I did not sign this," I whispered, tracing my finger over the fake signature. "I was at work 2 days ago during bank hours. I never authorized this transfer." A cold, terrifying smile slowly spread across the face of Diana. "That is exactly what I was hoping to hear," she said, leaning back in her chair. Carter thought he was being so clever by physically bypassing the digital limits. He thought that because it was a joint account, he could just push the paperwork through with a forged signature and deal with the civil fallout later in mediation. He assumed you would be too poor, too humiliated, and too heartbroken to fight him in court. But by forging your signature on a physical bank document to execute an unauthorized wire transfer, he crossed a massive legal line. Diana leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute predatory focus. "This is no longer just a messy divorce, Bethany. What Carter committed today is a federal felony. We are not just going to take his money, we are going to take his freedom." I felt a massive surge of adrenaline race through my veins. The trap was already closing around him, and he had no idea. But just as Diana began outlining our strategy to contact the federal authorities, her secure phone buzzed loudly against the glass table. She picked it up, glancing at the illuminated screen. Her sharp, professional demeanor briefly gave way to a look of profound, absolute disbelief. She let out a dry, humorless laugh and shook her head slowly. "You are not going to believe the absolute audacity of this man," she said, turning the phone around so I could see the screen. "While we sit here building a federal criminal case against him, your husband just filed an emergency motion in family court. He is officially petitioning for immediate spousal support. He claims he desperately needs temporary alimony to survive your severe financial abuse and maintain his accustomed standard of living." I stared at the illuminated screen of her phone, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his demand. Alimony. I repeated the word, feeling a bizarre mixture of absolute rage and hysterical disbelief. He physically steals $80,000 from my bank account, leaves me stranded at a bridal boutique, and now he is officially asking a family court judge to make me pay for his dates with a 24-year-old. Diana let out a sharp, dry laugh. "It is actually quite brilliant in its pure delusion," she said, leaning back. "He filed the motion under the premise that you were the primary breadwinner, which is factually true. But his justification exposes his incredible arrogance. He claims your refusal to fund his new business ventures constituted severe financial and emotional abuse. He states he requires immediate temporary spousal support to maintain the standard of living he became accustomed to during the marriage. He specifically noted he needs the funds to maintain his professional appearances while he negotiates a high-level partnership with Apex Logistics." I reached slowly for my coffee cup. Carter was playing a dangerous game of optics. He needed Vanessa and her wealthy father Richard to believe he was a successful executive. He could not afford to look like a desperate, broke man going through a messy divorce. He was trying to use the legal system to force me into funding his elaborate facade. He was genuinely convinced I would be so intimidated by the court filing that I would just agree to a quick settlement. Diana watched me process the information, her dark eyes gleaming. "Most attorneys would be scrambling to file a defensive response right now," she explained, tapping her pen. "They would be gathering bank statements and preparing to argue against his motion in a lengthy, miserable mediation session. But we are not going to do that, Bethany. We are going to let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly can. Because while he is busy playing games in family court, I have been pulling the corporate records on this massive logistics deal he is so desperate to close." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a different manila folder. This one was noticeably thinner, but carried an undeniable weight. "Whenever I take on a case involving a high-conflict spouse, I do a comprehensive background check on everyone involved." Diana continued, her voice dropping to a serious professional register. That includes the new mistress and her influential family. You mentioned Carter was obsessed with securing a partnership with Richard, the chief executive officer of Apex Logistics. He believes marrying Vanessa is his golden ticket into that corporate empire. I nodded, setting my coffee down. It is the only thing he has talked about for the last 8 months, I confirmed. His own career has been completely stagnant. He views Apex Logistics as his ultimate salvation. He is convinced that if he can land a vendor contract with them, he will finally have the wealth and status his mother always told him he deserved. Diana smiled, but it was a cold, calculated expression. Diana opened the thinner folder and slid a closing certificate across the table. The acquisition you authorized this afternoon has been completed, she said. The distressed company your holding group purchased is Apex Logistics. I looked down at the familiar name printed across the first page. Apex had been losing money because of outdated tracking systems, rising operating costs, and repeated supply chain failures. Richard would temporarily retain his title as chief executive officer to maintain stability. But the board, the capital budget, and every major vendor agreement were now controlled by my holding company. Diana tapped the final page. Carter is trying to use Vanessa to win a contract from a company you now control, she said. He believes Richard has the final authority. He does not know that every new partnership requires your approval. The silence in the penthouse suite was profound. Carter had destroyed our marriage, abandoned me in a store, and stolen my savings, all to secure a partnership with a company he thought would make him untouchable. He was currently parading Vanessa around town, bragging to his mother and his sister about his brilliant strategic upgrade. He was preparing to walk into a high-stakes meeting with Richard to finalize a contract that he believed would change his life forever. And the entire time, the ultimate authority to approve or deny that contract rested entirely in my hands. He has absolutely no idea, I whispered, the words slipping out as a shocked breath. He thinks he outsmarted me. He thinks he is about to become a millionaire by aligning himself with Richard. Diana leaned back, lacing her fingers together. He does not know anything, she agreed. He is entirely focused on the illusion of wealth. He sees a rich 24-year-old girl and a chief executive officer father, and he assumes he has hit the jackpot. He never bothered to look at the actual corporate structure because he is too arrogant to believe anyone could outmaneuver him. I sat back, sinking into the plush fabric of the chair. The rage boiling inside me transformed into a cold, calculating sense of absolute control. For years, I allowed Carter and his family to dictate my worth. They treated me like a pawn on their social chessboard, moving me around and discarding me when I was no longer useful. But Diana had just handed me the board. I was no longer a pawn. I was the one directing the entire game now. This was my turn to finally win. He had absolutely no idea at all. 2 days later, the morning of the mandatory mediation session arrived gray and overcast, mirroring the exact mood I needed to project. I stood in the luxurious marble bathroom of the penthouse suite, staring at my reflection in the massive mirror. Diana had instructed me to play my part perfectly, so I spent the morning carefully constructing the ultimate illusion of total defeat. I dug into the very bottom of my canvas duffel bag and pulled out a faded, oversized gray sweater that I normally only wore while scrubbing the floors. I paired it with cheap, rumpled black slacks that hung awkwardly on my frame, making me look incredibly fragile and small. I washed my face completely bare, stripping away any trace of makeup that might suggest I had the energy to care about my appearance or my future. I pulled my hair back into a messy, uneven ponytail, letting stray, dull strands fall limply around my tired eyes. I practiced looking down at the floor, hunching my shoulders forward to make myself appear physically smaller and entirely broken by the weight of my circumstances. When I finally met Diana in the grand lobby of the downtown legal building, she gave me a single appraising nod. "You look absolutely miserable," she whispered as we stepped into the polished brass elevator together. "It is perfect. Let them believe they have already won the war." We walked into the quiet, heavily carpeted waiting room of the mediation firm. I took a seat in the farthest corner, staring blankly at a stack of outdated magazines while Diana checked us in at the front desk. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open and the Blackwell family arrived in a loud, disruptive wave that demanded the attention of everyone in the room. Carter walked in first, exuding an almost comical level of inflated swagger. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that fit him flawlessly, clearly purchased recently. But what immediately caught my eye was the heavy gold watch gleaming brightly on his left wrist. It was a brand-new luxury Rolex, easily worth $15,000. I felt a sharp pang of revulsion, knowing exactly which drained joint bank account had funded that ridiculous purchase. Clinging tightly to his arm was Vanessa. She wore a designer cream-colored cashmere coat and oversized sunglasses, looking incredibly bored and thoroughly out of place in a sterile legal clinic. Trailing right behind them like loyal, aggressive bodyguards were Linda and Crystal. They both wore expensive winter coats and carried designer leather handbags, casting sharp, judgmental glares around the waiting room until their eyes finally locked onto me sitting quietly in the corner. Linda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pity, making sure her voice carried across the quiet room for the receptionist to hear. "Oh, just look at her," Linda whispered loudly, leaning toward Crystal with a cruel smirk. "She has completely let herself go. It is honestly tragic how quickly some weak women fall apart when a real man finally leaves them." Crystal snickered, pulling out her phone to check her reflection in the dark screen. "I mean, what did she really expect?" Crystal replied, adjusting her expensive lip gloss. "You cannot ignore your husband for 5 years acting like a boring robot and then act surprised when he upgrades to someone who actually knows how to dress and socialize." Carter simply smiled, a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn. He walked over to the receptionist desk, entirely ignoring my existence. He signed his name with a grand flourish, deliberately flashing the thick gold Rolex under the warm lobby lights. He was playing the role of the wealthy, successful executive to absolute perfection, making sure Vanessa saw him as a powerful man, taking swift control of his messy past. I kept my head down, staring at my scuffed flat shoes, forcing my hands to tremble slightly in my lap. I was playing the pathetic, discarded wife, and they were completely intoxicated by their perceived superiority. A paralegal eventually escorted all of us into a large conference room featuring a long, polished mahogany table. Mediation is typically meant only for the two spouses and their legal counsel, but Linda had aggressively insisted on being present as a moral support system for her son. The mediator, a tired-looking older man with thick reading glasses, simply sighed and allowed it, rather than fighting her famously demanding personality. Diana and I sat quietly on one side of the table, while Carter, Vanessa, Linda, and Crystal lined up on the opposite side, like a hostile firing squad. The mediator cleared his throat, explaining that the primary goal today was to reach an amicable separation of assets, specifically regarding the marital home and the remaining liquid funds. Before he could even finish his standard introductory remarks, Linda interrupted him, leaning forward and placing her manicured hands flat on the polished wood surface. "There is really nothing complicated to negotiate here today," Linda stated, her tone dripping with absolute venomous authority. "My son has suffered enough emotional neglect over the past 7 years of this sham marriage." Bethany was entirely frigid, completely obsessed with her little data entry job, and totally incapable of providing a warm, nurturing environment. She is an unstable, socially awkward workaholic who drove him away. Carter nodded solemnly, playing the wounded, long-suffering victim perfectly. "I really tried to make it work," he said, his voice thick with fake sincerity. "But she was so controlling with the finances. She refused to support my career ambitions. She just wanted to keep me trapped in a boring suburban life. I need the marital home to maintain my professional standing, especially now that I am finalizing major corporate contracts with Apex Logistics." Crystal chimed in, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Seriously, she just wants to drag this out because she is incredibly bitter. She should just sign the house over today and walk away before she embarrasses herself even more in front of our friends." Vanessa sat quietly examining her perfect manicure, pretending not to listen, but clearly absorbing the toxic narrative they were eagerly feeding her. They firmly demanded that I surrender all equity in the house immediately and waive my right to any spousal support, allowing Carter to take full ownership of the property without contest. I looked up from the mahogany table, allowing hot tears to pool naturally in my eyes. I made sure my voice wavered heavily when I finally spoke. "But I paid the entire down payment on that house," I whispered, clutching my hands together tightly against my chest. "I worked so incredibly hard for that money. I have nowhere else to go right now. You took everything else from the bank accounts, Carter. You cannot take the house too." Carter scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. "I took what I was owed for wasting my best years on a dead-end marriage," he snapped coldly. "You can rent a cheap apartment near your boring office. You do not need a 4-bedroom house. You do not even have friends to invite over anyway." The mediator looked highly uncomfortable, sensing the extreme hostility radiating across the room. He turned to Diana, fully expecting her to launch a vicious legal defense on my behalf to protect my assets. Instead, Diana played her part perfectly. She let out a long, defeated sigh and leaned toward me, whispering just loud enough for the entire room to hear clearly. "Bethany, we have to be realistic about our options here," Diana said, her voice laced with mock sympathy and resignation. "Going to a full trial will take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. You simply do not have the funds to fight him right now since the accounts are empty. If we drag this out, he might win even more in court based on his new alimony claims against you. It might be best to just cut your massive losses and sign the preliminary agreement today." I let a single heavy tear slip down my cheek, wiping it away slowly with the frayed sleeve of my oversized gray sweater. I looked across the table at Linda, who was smiling with absolute wicked triumph. I looked at Carter, who was practically vibrating with unchecked arrogance. I let out a broken, pathetic sob, nodding my head slowly in defeat. "Fine," I whispered, my voice cracking terribly. "Just give me the paperwork. I will sign it. I just want this absolute nightmare to be over." Carter grinned broadly, shooting a victorious look at Vanessa. The mediator placed the agreement in front of me. Carter watched the pen with the hungry concentration of a man convinced that owning the house would prove he had won everything. The heavy black ink pen echoed loudly in the silent room. I deliberately trembled as I formed the final loop of my signature, ensuring my performance remained flawless. I slid the document toward the mediator, keeping my eyes cast downward. Carter snatched the parchment before the mediator could reach for it. He examined my signature with a greedy gleam in his eyes. He actually let out a low chuckle of triumph. His attorney gave it a quick, superficial glance before nodding in approval. Linda leaned back, letting out a loud sigh of profound relief, as if a terrible burden had been lifted. Crystal typed furiously on her phone, updating her bridesmaids about crushing the pathetic ex-wife. Vanessa adjusted her sunglasses, clearly bored and ready for their lunch. The mediator gathered the signed copies, stamping them with his seal, and offering generic closing remarks that nobody listened to. The arrogant Blackwell family was entirely consumed by their absolute victory. I kept my posture hunched, playing the broken woman perfectly. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught a slight movement from Diana. She shifted her leather briefcase on the table and briefly caught my gaze. For a fraction of a second, the fierce shark-like attorney allowed a tiny, sharp smile to touch the corners of her mouth. It was a covert look of absolute shared understanding. The bait had been taken. Carter stood up aggressively, buttoning the jacket of his expensive custom navy suit. He deliberately turned his back on me, offering his arm to Vanessa with a sickening display of exaggerated chivalry. "Let us get out of here," he announced loudly. "I made reservations at the steakhouse to celebrate. We have planning to do for the new house, Vanessa." Linda stood up, shooting me one last look of absolute pity and disgust. "You made the right choice today, Bethany," she said. "It is better to just walk away quietly than to embarrass yourself fighting." I did not respond, simply letting another fake tear slide down my cheek. The four of them marched out of the conference room, laughing and talking loudly, their voices echoing down the carpeted hallway, until the heavy glass doors finally clicked shut behind them. The mediator excused himself, leaving us alone. The instant the door closed, the oppressive atmosphere completely evaporated. I slowly straightened my spine, wiping the fake tears from my face. My trembling hands became perfectly steady. Diana slid our copy of the agreement into a protective folder, letting out a genuine laugh. "That was an absolute masterpiece of a performance, Bethany," she said, shaking her head in sheer admiration. "They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to punish you that they did not even bother to have their attorney read the final page of the property disclosures." I stood up from my chair, slowly stretching my stiff back muscles. What Carter, Linda, and Crystal entirely failed to realize was that the marital home they had just fought so aggressively to steal was not a conventional asset. When we first purchased the property 3 years ago, Carter foolishly insisted on a luxury neighborhood we could not actually afford. To make the numbers work and to keep him from throwing a tantrum, I had structured the financing through a highly specific, adjustable rate mortgage program. It was a calculated risk I took, knowing my proprietary software was gaining traction and would eventually pay off the house entirely. But the specific terms of that mortgage were brutal. The loan required a massive hidden balloon payment to settle the initial principal deficiency. That payment was exactly $150,000. And according to the strict timeline of the original contract, that massive lump sum was due in exactly 30 days. By demanding sole ownership of the property to show off to Vanessa and secure his image as a wealthy executive, Carter had just legally assumed 100% of that debt. The mediation agreement he signed so eagerly explicitly stated that he took the property as is absorbing all current and future liabilities associated with the deed. I no longer held any legal responsibility for the mortgage or the impending balloon payment. Diana tapped the thick folder containing the newly signed agreement, her dark eyes shining with absolute predatory delight. "He is completely doomed," she stated flatly. "Even with the $80,000 he stole from your joint accounts, he is $70,000 short of making that payment. And that assumes he does not spend a single penny of your money between now and the end of the month. But we both know he is already using those funds to buy Rolex watches, custom suits, and expensive steakhouse dinners to impress his new mistress. His actual salary at the logistics firm barely covers his car lease and his golf club memberships. There is absolutely no way he can secure a secondary loan or refinance the house in his name alone, especially with a federal wire fraud investigation quietly building against him. When the bank comes calling for that $150,000 in 30 days, he will immediately default. The bank will foreclose on the property. His credit will be completely destroyed, and his carefully constructed illusion of wealth will instantly shatter. He demanded the house to elevate his status, but he just signed a legally binding contract guaranteeing his own absolute imminent bankruptcy. I walked over to the conference room window, looking down at the busy Chicago streets. Carter and his entourage walked down the sidewalk laughing like they owned the city. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They thought they had successfully executed the perfect betrayal. But they had merely locked themselves inside a burning building and handed me the only key to the exit. We left the legal clinic, stepping into the cold afternoon air. I pulled my faded, oversized gray sweater tightly around me, not because I felt small, but because the chill was biting. My mind was racing forward. The financial trap was perfectly set, and the legal clock was officially ticking down to his ruin. But the silent destruction of his credit score was not enough. The Blackwell family had humiliated me publicly, repeatedly, and with profound malice. They needed to face the consequences of their actions in the exact same manner. From that moment forward, the timeline began to rapidly accelerate. Over the next 6 days, I remained completely silent. I did not call Linda. I did not text Carter. I simply let them bathe in their false sense of absolute security. I spent my days working closely with my wealth management team, restructuring the Apex Logistics acquisition and solidifying my new corporate empire. The parent company officially took control of the logistics firm operations, and I began quietly reviewing the vendor contracts, including the proposed partnership Carter was desperately trying to secure. Every single piece of the puzzle was falling perfectly into place. While Carter was busy planning a future in a house he would lose in a month and relying on a career, I now completely controlled the date of the highly anticipated society wedding finally arrived. Crystal was about to host her lavish celebration at the most exclusive country club in the state. It was the perfect stage for the final confrontation, a spectacular venue where the intricate web of lies Carter and his family had spun would be violently and publicly detonated. The week before the ceremony passed in a blur of quiet, calculated preparation. I remained in the penthouse suite, transforming the luxurious dining area into a fully functional corporate command center. My days were consumed entirely by conference calls with legal teams and financial advisors as we tightened our grip on Apex Logistics. I reviewed every vendor contract Richard submitted for approval, including the partnership proposal from the logistics firm that employed Carter. Reading his desperate, inflated projections on official letterhead was comical. He promised Richard the world completely unaware I held the pen that would sign his rejection. Late Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week before Crystal would walk down the aisle, my encrypted phone illuminated with a notification. It was a text message forwarded from my old phone number. The sender was Linda. I opened the message leaning back against the leather sofa. The text was a masterpiece of cruelty, perfectly capturing her toxic personality. Do not even bother trying to crash the wedding to win Carter back. The message began. You are socially unfit for our circles, and Vanessa fits in perfectly with the guests. Carter is finalizing the massive Apex Logistics contract with Richard at the reception dinner anyway, so please have the dignity to just leave us alone. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the insulting words twice. A month ago, a message like that would have sent me spiraling into a deep panic attack. It would have reinforced every terrible insecurity they had ever planted in my mind, making me feel small and entirely worthless. But sitting in a 5-star penthouse as the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar holding company, the text simply felt pathetic. Linda was desperately trying to maintain control over a narrative that had already slipped through her fingers. She wanted me to feel excluded from an event I was currently funding through the balloon mortgage she had so foolishly encouraged her son to assume. I did not type a reply. I did not send a witty comeback or an angry paragraph defending my social worth. I simply locked the phone and set it face down on the glass table. Silence is often the most terrifying response you can give to a narcissist. Instead of engaging with her petty high school drama, I picked up the landline phone provided by the hotel concierge and made a highly specific request. Within 2 hours, an exclusive personal shopper and a master tailor arrived at my suite, carrying heavy garment bags filled with the finest couture available in the city. I spent the entire evening trying on garments until I found the exact piece of armor I needed for the reception. It was a custom-designed midnight blue gown, crafted from heavy, luxurious silk. The fabric flowed like liquid sapphire, catching the light with every subtle movement. It featured a sharp, elegant neckline and a sweeping skirt that commanded absolute attention without being overly flashy. It was the exact opposite of the drab, oversized sweaters they expected me to wear. When I faced the mirror, I understood that the gown had not transformed me. It had simply made visible the confidence I had spent years hiding to keep other people comfortable. With my wardrobe secured, I turned my attention to the logistics of the event itself. Crystal had chosen the Oak Brook Heritage Club for her extravagant reception. It was one of the most exclusive, highly sought-after venues in the state, boasting manicured golf courses, grand crystal chandeliers, and a membership waiting list that spanned over a decade. Linda had bragged about securing the location for months, claiming it proved their family belonged in the upper echelons of high society. But like everything else in their lives, the Blackwell family only understood the superficial layer of wealth. They cared about the brand names and the address, but they never bothered to look at the actual ownership structures behind the luxury they consumed. If they had bothered to do a simple public records search, they would have discovered a very inconvenient truth. The Oak Brook Heritage Club was not independently owned. 10 years ago, the club had faced severe financial difficulties and was quietly bought out by a private equity board to avoid bankruptcy and public scandal. That specific private equity board had recently been acquired as a subsidiary asset during the massive corporate buyout my wealth management team had orchestrated. My newly formed holding company was now the primary majority shareholder of the entire country club. I did not just have a membership. I effectively owned the building, the golf course, the grand ballroom, and the very ground Crystal was planning to dance on. I walked over to the sprawling glass dining table and opened my encrypted laptop. I accessed the secure internal directory for the subsidiary companies and located the direct contact information for the head of security at the Oak Brook Heritage Club. I picked up my phone and dialed the unlisted number. A gruff professional voice answered on the first ring, identifying himself as the security director. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "This is Bethany, the chief executive officer of the parent holding company that recently acquired your board. I am calling to discuss the security protocols for the Blackwell wedding reception scheduled for next weekend." There was a brief pause on the line as the security director processed the name. "Yes, Mom," he replied, his tone instantly shifting from gruff to incredibly respectful. "I was informed by corporate that you might be reaching out regarding the operations. How can my team assist you tonight?" I outlined my exact requirements with cold, clinical precision. I informed him that I would be attending the reception as an unannounced VIP guest. I instructed him that under no circumstances was anyone in the Blackwell family allowed to dictate my movements or attempt to have me removed from the premises. I explained that Carter and his mother might attempt to cause a scene or demand my expulsion, but the security staff was to stand down and observe my absolute authority over the venue. "Understood completely, ma'am," the security director confirmed without a single trace of hesitation. "You have full clearance. My team will be fully briefed and stationed accordingly. We will follow your lead entirely. If anyone attempts to disrespect you or remove you from your own property, we will intervene on your behalf immediately." I thanked him and ended the short call, setting the phone down next to the custom midnight blue gown resting on the sofa. Everything was perfectly aligned. Linda thought she had permanently banished me from their elite social circle with a single cruel text message. Carter thought he was walking into a triumphant celebration where he would secure his financial future alongside his young, beautiful mistress and his oblivious new father-in-law. They were all marching happily toward a grand ballroom, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into my personal arena. I looked out the penthouse window at the glittering city lights, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was taken, and the locks were secured. All that remained was for me to put on my armor walk through those heavy mahogany doors and burn their absolute illusion of superiority straight to the ground. Saturday evening arrived with a biting winter chill that amplified the welcoming lights of the Oak Brook Heritage Club. My chauffeur pulled the car up to the entrance where valet attendants rushed to park luxury vehicles. I stepped out, taking a moment to adjust the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown. The fabric draped perfectly over my frame, feeling less like clothing and more like a suit of armor designed for battle. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking rhythmically. The two men at the front doors recognized me immediately from the security briefing. They gave synchronized, respectful nods and pulled the doors open without asking for my invitation. I stepped past them into the sprawling foyer. The warm air inside was thick with the scent of floral arrangements. From the grand ballroom down the hall, the muffled sounds of a 10-piece live band and the chatter of wealthy guests echoed through the corridor. I walked down the hallway, stopping just short of the mahogany double doors that led into the main reception area. Through the slightly parted crack, I could see the spectacle playing out as I had envisioned it. The ballroom was a chaotic sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, towering white centerpieces, and endlessly flowing champagne. At the far end of the room, standing near the head table, Carter was in his absolute element. He was standing close to Vanessa, and an older, distinguished man I recognized from my corporate files as Richard, her father. Carter was leaning in, holding a low-ball glass of expensive scotch, and laughing too hard at whatever Richard had just said. He was gesturing wildly, playing the role of the confident, brilliant young executive closing a deal. Vanessa hung tightly off his arm, looking smug and polished in her pale pink bridesmaid dress. Not too far from their group, Linda was holding court near the wedding cake. She was surrounded by a tight circle of women dripping in diamonds and pearls. Even from my hidden vantage point, I could read her exaggerated body language. She was waving her hands dramatically, telling a skewed and malicious version of my departure from their family. She was bragging about how swiftly her successful son had upgraded his life, trading a boring, introverted nobody for a vibrant young heiress. She took a slow sip from her tall flute of champagne, throwing her head back in a triumphant laugh. It was a perfectly choreographed, sickening display of the Blackwell family arrogance. They were celebrating a victory they had not won using money they did not have in a building they did not realize I owned. I took one final deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I placed both of my hands flat against the wood of the mahogany doors and pushed them wide open. The metal hinges were silent, but the visual impact of the doors parting was immediate and dramatic. I stepped over the threshold and into the warm light of the grand ballroom. I did not rush or sneak in through the side walls to avoid detection. I walked straight down the center aisle, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded undeniable attention. The midnight blue silk of my gown caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, shimmering with a quiet, terrifying power. My hair was styled in sophisticated waves, falling perfectly over my bare shoulders, and the subtle diamond drop earrings I wore sparkled sharply with every step I took. I looked nothing like the tired, defeated woman who had signed away her home in a rumpled gray sweater just a few days prior. I looked like a different human being. The physical transformation was so severe and the entrance so commanding that the shift in the room happened instantaneously. A woman sitting at the table nearest the doors stopped talking mid-sentence, staring at me with wide, shocked eyes. The older man sitting next to her turned his head to follow her gaze, and within seconds, a ripple effect of stunned silence swept across the ballroom. The chatter began to die down rapidly, section by section, table by table, until the only sound left was the live band playing a soft jazz melody on the main stage. And then, even the band leader noticed the shifting atmosphere and awkwardly signaled his musicians to lower their volume until the music faded out completely into heavy dead air. The total silence in the room was absolute and incredibly suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes were locked firmly onto me as I glided across the polished hardwood floor. Near the front of the room, Linda finally turned her head to see what had caused the sudden, unnatural quiet. Her eyes landed directly on me, and the smug, triumphant smile literally slid completely off her face. Her jaw went slack. Her fingers lost their tight grip, and the delicate crystal champagne flute she was holding slipped right out of her hand. It hit the marble border of the dance floor with a loud, sharp crack, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces and sending sparkling wine splashing across the expensive shoes of her wealthy friends. She did not even blink or look down at the wet mess. She just stared at me, looking as though she had just seen a terrifying ghost manifest in the exact center of her perfect elite party. Sitting at the head table, Crystal dropped her silver fork onto her plate, her mouth hanging open as she realized her spotlight had been stolen. A few feet away, Carter slowly turned around. The confident, powerful posture he had been projecting for Richard vanished in a single heartbeat. All color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin looking like pale chalk. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at the heavy midnight blue gown, at my perfectly calm expression, and at the terrifying confidence radiating from my every movement. The woman he had bullied and abandoned in a bridal boutique was walking confidently through the most exclusive room in the city, looking like she owned the entire world. Vanessa tugged gently at his sleeve, looking confused by his sudden paralysis, but he did not acknowledge her. He was entirely frozen, locked in a stare of pure, unadulterated shock. The intense paralysis only lasted for a few seconds before sheer panic and blinding anger violently took over his body. Carter realized instantly that his carefully constructed illusion of perfection was in extreme danger of collapsing right in front of Richard and his new high society peers. He shoved his scotch glass onto a passing waiter tray with such aggressive force that the amber liquid sloshed over the crystal rim. He broke away from the VIP table, his fists clenching tightly at his sides as his face flushed bright red. He marched aggressively across the empty dance floor, closing the distance between us with rapid, furious strides. His face was twisting into a dark mask of pure fury, his panicked eyes darting frantically around the quiet room to see exactly who was watching this unfold. He stopped just inches away from me, trying desperately to use his physical height to intimidate me into submission. He leaned his head down close to mine, his breath smelling sharply of expensive alcohol and blind, terrified panic. "What do you think you are doing here?" He hissed, his voice a low, venomous, hateful whisper, meant only for my ears. "You need to turn around and leave right this second before I have security drag you out of here and throw you onto the street." I listened to his empty threats without feeling a single ounce of fear. A week ago, the venom in his voice would have caused me to shrink away in tears. Tonight, it sounded pathetic. I did not flinch or break eye contact with him. I offered him a slow, composed smile that unnerved him further. "Security works for me tonight, Carter," I said, my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for the guests nearby to hear. "So I highly suggest you lower your voice and step aside before I have them escort you out of the building." His mouth opened and closed silently. The unwavering certainty in my tone paralyzed him completely. He took a confused, involuntary step backward, giving me the exact opening I needed. I did not waste another second looking at him. I turned my attention away from his pale face and walked smoothly past his frozen frame, heading directly toward the main head table where Richard and Vanessa were sitting. The older man was watching the bizarre exchange with mild curiosity. He clearly recognized that some sort of personal drama was unfolding, but he had no idea who I was or how I fit into the equation. As I approached the large circular table, the remaining chatter in the immediate vicinity died down completely. People were holding their breath, waiting to see what the mysterious woman in the midnight blue silk gown was going to do next. Vanessa scowled at me, leaning closer to her father and whispering something frantic behind her manicured hand. I stopped right in front of Richard, ignoring the hostile glare coming from the young woman sitting next to him. Richard set his white cloth napkin on the table and stood up, smoothing the lapels of his black tuxedo. He looked at me with the polite, guarded expression of an experienced corporate executive sizing up a potential rival or a new client. I extended my right hand toward him, offering a bright, confident smile that radiated quiet power. "We have not formally met yet," Richard, I said, keeping my tone warm but highly professional. "My name is Bethany. I am the Chief Executive Officer and the majority shareholder of the parent holding company that recently acquired Apex Logistics. I am your new boss." The words hung in the quiet air, carrying perfectly across the silent ballroom. For a long, agonizing moment, Richard just stared at my outstretched hand, processing the massive piece of information I had just handed him. He had been dealing exclusively with my legal team and wealth managers for the past month. He knew a brilliant, mysterious billionaire investor had swooped in to save his dying legacy from total bankruptcy, but he had never been given a proper name or a face. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. His guarded expression instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer delight and profound relief. He eagerly reached out and grasped my hand, shaking it with genuine enthusiasm. "Bethany," he exclaimed, his deep voice booming with sudden, joyous energy. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you. My legal team has spoken of nothing else but your brilliant restructuring strategies and your incredible vision for our future. We had no idea you were planning to attend this reception tonight. If we had known, we would have prepared a proper welcome. Please sit down and join us." He pulled out the empty chair next to him, gesturing for the nearest waiter to bring another glass of champagne. Richard was completely oblivious to the toxic family dynamics swirling around him. He did not know I was the discarded, abused ex-wife of the man desperately trying to court his daughter. He only saw the powerful billionaire savior who had rescued his failing company from the brink of collapse. His deference to me was the ultimate validation of my hard work. He treated me with a level of respect and admiration that Carter and his family had spent 7 years denying me. Standing just a few feet behind my chair, Carter looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. His jaw had literally hit the floor. He stared at Richard, treating me like royalty, and his mind short-circuited. He looked wildly between my calm face and the older man, trying to make sense of the impossible reality unfolding in front of his eyes. The boring little data analyst he had abandoned in a bridal boutique and robbed blind was now receiving a hero welcome from the chief executive officer he idolized. Vanessa looked equally confused and angry. She tugged on the sleeve of her father, demanding to know what was going on. "Dad, why are you talking to her like that?" Vanessa whined. "That is the crazy ex-wife of Carter. She is here to ruin the wedding. She does not own your company. She is nobody." Richard turned to his daughter, his cheerful expression hardening instantly into a sharp reprimand. "Vanessa, keep your voice down and show some respect," he scolded. "This woman is the head of our parent corporation. She owns the controlling interest in Apex Logistics. You will speak to her with the utmost courtesy, or you will leave this table immediately." Vanessa shrank back into her seat, mortified by the harsh scolding from her father. Carter stood entirely frozen, his face draining of whatever color had managed to return. He was staring at me with a look of pure terror. He finally realized the catastrophic mistake he had made. He had spent months manipulating Vanessa simply to get close to her father. He had stolen my savings, forged my signature, and destroyed our marriage to secure a vendor partnership that he believed would make him a millionaire. And he had just discovered that I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. I turned my attention back to Richard, taking the seat he had offered me and accepting the fresh glass of champagne from the trembling waiter. Richard leaned in, eager to talk business. "I am so glad you are here, Bethany," he said. "I was actually just discussing a lucrative vendor partnership with Carter. His logistics firm has put together a proposal that I think you will find beneficial for our supply chain model." I took a slow sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp taste. I let the silence stretch out for a few seconds, letting Carter sweat under the chandeliers. I slowly lowered my glass and turned my gaze toward Carter, who was practically shaking with fear. I looked him in the eyes, letting him see the cold finality in my expression. I turned my head back to Richard, maintaining my polite smile. "Actually, Richard, I have already reviewed that vendor proposal in detail during my internal audit this week," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent area. "And while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I am afraid we will not be moving forward with that contract." Richard blinked in surprise, taken aback by the decisive rejection. "Oh," he said, sounding disappointed. "May I ask why?" The numbers seemed quite promising. I kept my eyes locked onto Carter, watching the despair wash over his pale face. "The numbers were entirely fabricated," I stated calmly. "But more importantly, the partnership is effectively terminated immediately due to severe ethical concerns regarding the executive presenting the deal. We do not do business with individuals who engage in financial fraud." The word fraud hung heavy in the air. Richard dropped his hand back to his side, his expression hardening instantly. "Fraud," he repeated the word, tasting sour on his tongue. "What exactly are you talking about, Bethany?" Carter finally found his voice, though it was trembling uncontrollably. "She is lying," he stammered, taking a step toward the table. "She is just a bitter, jealous ex-wife trying to ruin my professional reputation because I left her. Do not listen to a single word she says, Richard. She is completely unstable." Before Richard could demand a proper explanation, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the dance floor. Linda and Crystal had seen the entire exchange from afar and realized the situation was rapidly deteriorating. They practically sprinted across the polished hardwood, their expensive heels clicking loudly in their desperate panic. Linda reached the VIP table first, her face flushed red with exertion and fury. She immediately grabbed the arm of her son, trying to pull him back away from the table. "Carter, stop talking," she hissed under her breath. Then she turned her venomous glare toward me, plastering on a fake, sickeningly sweet smile for Richard. "I am so incredibly sorry for this unseemly interruption, Richard," she said, her voice pitched artificially high. "My former daughter-in-law has been struggling with some severe mental health issues since the separation. Please excuse her erratic behavior. She is prone to making wild, unfounded accusations when she forgets to take her medication." Crystal stepped up right beside her mother, glaring daggers at me. "You need to leave right now, Bethany," Crystal demanded, crossing her arms over her expensive white gown. "You have caused enough of a scene. This is my wedding day, and you are completely ruining my vibes. Security is already on their way to throw you out, so you might as well save yourself the embarrassment and walk out the door." I did not even blink at their coordinated gaslighting attempt. I remained comfortably seated in my chair, taking another small sip of my champagne. "Security is not coming to throw me out, Crystal," I replied, my tone completely conversational and light. "As I just explained to Richard, I am the chief executive officer of the parent company that owns this entire country club. I own this ballroom. I am exactly where I belong. But you are absolutely right about one thing. It is time for someone to leave the party." I raised my right hand slightly and made a subtle, deliberate gesture toward the back of the grand ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors I had entered through swung open once again. Two tall, broad-shouldered men dressed in sharp, nondescript dark gray suits stepped into the room. They moved with a distinct, purposeful stride that instantly set them apart from the wedding guests. The country club security guards stationed near the entrance did not try to stop them. In fact, the security director gave them a respectful nod and cleared a path through the lingering crowd. The two men bypassed the ice sculptures and the lavish dessert tables, walking in a perfectly straight line directly toward our section of the room. Carter watched them approach, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs seemed completely glued to the floor. Linda dropped her fake smile entirely, her grip tightening on the arm of her son. "Who are those men?" she demanded, her voice rising in genuine panic. "Carter, what is going on here?" Carter could not answer. He was staring at the approaching figures like a man facing a firing squad. The two men reached the VIP table and stopped right in front of Carter. The taller of the two reached into the inner breast pocket of his dark suit jacket and pulled out a small black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a shining silver shield. He did not shout or make a grand, dramatic display. He kept his voice low, calm, and entirely authoritative, ensuring only the people standing immediately around the table could hear his words. "Carter Blackwell," the detective said, shutting his badge wallet and sliding it back into his pocket. "We are federal investigators with the Financial Crimes Division. We need you to step outside with us right now. We have a few questions regarding a fraudulent wire transfer that was executed at your bank branch last week." The air seemed to completely vanish from the room. Linda gasped loudly, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth. Crystal took a massive step backward, her face draining of color as she realized real law enforcement had just crashed her perfect reception. Carter swallowed hard, a thick drop of sweat rolling down the side of his pale face. "I do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, his voice barely a squeak. "There must be some kind of massive misunderstanding. I have not done anything illegal." The second detective stepped forward, his expression completely blank and entirely unimpressed by the weak denial. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwell," the second investigator said. "We have the forged authorization form, the branch surveillance footage, and a sworn statement from Bethany. You can walk out with us quietly, or we can place you in handcuffs here in front of everyone. Either way, you are leaving with us." Carter looked completely broken. His shoulders slumped forward and the arrogant posture he had carried for the past 7 years entirely evaporated. He looked down at his wrist where the heavy new gold Rolex gleamed under the chandeliers. The watch he bought with my stolen life savings was now a shining piece of physical evidence tying him directly to a federal crime. He looked at his mother, hoping she would swoop in and fix the problem like she always did. But Linda was completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public scandal unfolding right in front of her wealthy friends. She could not gaslight a federal investigator. Then Carter turned his desperate, pleading eyes toward Vanessa. "Vanessa, please," he begged. "Tell your father this is a mistake. I was doing all of this for us. I was trying to build our future together." Vanessa did not reach out to take his hand. Instead, she took 2 large steps backward, physically distancing herself from him. Her eyes were wide with absolute calculated horror. "You lied to me about everything," she snapped, her voice incredibly cold. "You are nothing but a criminal who steals from his own wife. My family will not be associated with a felon. We are over." "Are we going to walk, Mr. Blackwell, or are we going to make a scene?" the first detective asked. Carter let out a defeated whimper. He slowly nodded his head. "I will walk," he whispered, completely devoid of dignity. The taller detective pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs, keeping them highly visible as a silent warning. "You have the right to remain silent." The detective began reciting the familiar Miranda warning in a steady, practiced voice that cut cleanly through the remaining ambient noise of the breathless ballroom. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the heavy legal words washed over the VIP table, Vanessa physically recoiled. She literally took another massive step backward, treating Carter as though he had suddenly contracted a highly contagious and dangerous disease. Her ruthless self-preservation instincts kicked in with stunning speed. She looked at the horrified, staring faces of the wealthy, elite guests watching the scene and immediately realized that associating with a disgraced felon would completely destroy her own pristine social standing. "Dad, we have to go right now," she announced, her voice deliberately loud enough for all the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "I had absolutely no idea he was a criminal. He lied to me this entire time, telling me he was a highly successful corporate executive. I would never intentionally associate with someone who steals money from his own family." Richard placed a protective arm around the bare shoulders of his daughter, glaring at Carter with absolute unmasked disgust. "You are a complete fraud, Carter," Richard said, his deep voice echoing with heavy finality. "Do not ever contact my daughter or my company again. You are entirely finished in this industry." Carter reached his trembling hand out toward Vanessa, his eyes brimming with pathetic, desperate tears. But she turned her back to him, completely severing the relationship right there on the polished dance floor. He had thrown away his entire marriage, his dignity and his secure future for her, and she discarded him the exact second he became a liability to her precious family reputation. The public rejection was the final necessary spark that ignited the rest of the room. Crystal stood frozen at the head table, watching her perfect multi-thousand-dollar wedding reception devolve into absolute frantic whispered chaos. The hushed murmurs of the 200 guests rapidly swelled into a loud, chaotic buzzing sound that filled the massive space. Everyone was pulling out their phones, aggressively texting the scandalous details to their friends in the city. The groom and his family, who were seated at the opposite end of the long, decorated head table, stood up looking completely mortified. They were an established old money family who prided themselves on impeccable public reputations and flawless social grace. The mother of the groom leaned over and whispered frantically to her husband. Her face twisted in utter horror as she realized the in-laws they had just legally tethered themselves to were not wealthy socialites, but broke, desperate frauds facing imminent federal prison charges. Crystal grabbed the arm of her new husband, crying hysterically, ruining her expensive makeup, and begging him to make the police leave. But he pulled his arm away forcefully, looking at her with a mixture of pure anger and deep, profound regret. The carefully constructed illusion of the Blackwell family wealth was shattering into a million sharp, unrecoverable pieces. Everyone in the ballroom now knew that the extravagant floral arrangements, the imported vintage champagne, and the custom-beaded wedding gown were all funded by stolen money and a fraudulent balloon mortgage. They were the ultimate social pariahs, stripped completely bare in front of the exact people they so desperately wanted to impress and manipulate. Linda could not handle the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. Her entire identity was built entirely on the perception of her unearned superiority, and she was watching it burn to the ground in real time. Desperate to regain control, she spotted the general manager of the Oak Brook Heritage Club. He was standing near the main entrance, flanked closely by the silent security director, calmly observing the situation unfold. Linda marched over to him, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the floor, while she breathed heavily in sheer panic. She pointed a trembling manicured finger toward me and the federal detectives. "You need to stop this right now," Linda demanded, her voice shrill and echoing with panicked, unhinged entitlement. "I paid an absolute fortune to rent this venue. You work for me tonight. I demand that you have your security staff escort those officers and that crazy woman out of my ballroom immediately. This is a private event, and she is trespassing on our property." The general manager did not flinch or look intimidated. He looked at Linda with an expression of polite, absolute indifference. "I apologize for the disruption to your evening," Mrs. Blackwell, the manager said, his tone entirely devoid of actual sympathy. "However, I cannot comply with that ridiculous request. Law enforcement officials have jurisdiction here, and more importantly, that woman is not trespassing." Linda scoffed, her face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "Not trespassing," she shrieked loudly. "I did not invite her. She has absolutely no right to be here." The general manager offered a small, cold smile. "Mrs. Blackwell, Ms. Bethany is the controlling owner of this property," the manager said calmly. "Security answers to her. If anyone is removed from the building tonight, that decision will be hers." Linda physically staggered backward as if the manager had violently slapped her across the face. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but she could not form a single coherent word. The ultimate realization of her absolute total defeat finally crashed down upon her shoulders. She had spent years treating me like dirt, assuming I was a worthless nobody, and now she was standing in my building drinking my champagne and watching her golden child being hauled away by federal agents. The two detectives firmly grasped the arms of Carter and began walking him across the grand ballroom toward the heavy mahogany doors. The sea of wealthy guests parted immediately, refusing to make eye contact with him as he passed. I slowly turned and followed a few paces behind them, wanting to ensure he actually left my property without causing further damage. We stepped out of the crowded ballroom and into the quiet, sprawling luxury of the grand front lobby. The cool night air drafted in through the sliding glass entrance doors, where a dark federal vehicle was already waiting at the bottom of the stone steps with its lights flashing. As we reached the center of the massive, echoing lobby, the sheer reality of his impending doom finally broke through his thick wall of shock. Carter realized he was about to be locked in a federal holding cell with absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney and no house to return to. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed right onto the pristine marble floor of the country club lobby. The detectives tried to pull him back up by his arms, but he fought them, dropping heavily to his knees. He turned his tear-stained face toward me, his entire body shaking with violent, desperate sobs. Defeated, publicly humiliated, and facing years in federal prison, he looked up at me completely broken. "Bethany, please," he cried out, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic terror. "Please, I am begging you for mercy." I looked down at the man kneeling on the cold marble floor. This was the same man who had smiled at me in a bridal boutique just days ago, promising to pull the car around before stealing my life savings and abandoning me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I did not feel the urge to scream or gloat over his profound downfall. I did not shed a tear for the death of our marriage because the marriage had never truly existed. He had never been a partner. He had been a parasite. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out as his desperate sobs echoed through the massive lobby. The federal detectives paused, granting me a brief moment to respond. I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes, maintaining absolute chilling composure. "You never actually wanted a wife, Carter. I said, my voice steady and echoing with quiet, devastating clarity. You did not want me. You wanted a scapegoat to fund your delusions of grandeur. You wanted someone to blindly absorb the cost of your endless failures so you could pretend to be a king. He shook his head frantically, reaching out a trembling hand to grab the hem of my midnight blue gown. I took a deliberate step back, ensuring his fingers grasped nothing but empty air. Unfortunately for you, Carter, I continued, staring down at his broken frame. I am the one who owned the slaughterhouse all along. You just walked yourself right onto the killing floor. Carter let out a gut-wrenching wail as the two detectives finally hoisted him to his feet. They did not grant him another second to beg. They turned him around firmly, guiding him toward the sliding glass doors and the flashing lights of the federal vehicle waiting outside. I turned my attention away from him and looked at Linda. She had followed us out of the ballroom and was now leaning heavily against a marble pillar, weeping uncontrollably. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, completely ruining her carefully crafted high society facade. She looked incredibly old and entirely defeated. I walked over to her, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. She flinched as I approached, expecting me to hurl insults or scream at her for the years of emotional abuse she had inflicted upon me. Instead, I simply opened my small designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the folded piece of paper I had carried with me since that freezing afternoon in downtown Chicago. It was the unpaid $12,000 invoice for the custom wedding gown Crystal was currently wearing. I held the crisp paper out to her. Linda stared at it, her hands shaking violently as she slowly reached out to take it from my fingers. I believe this belongs to you, Linda, I said, my tone perfectly polite and terrifyingly calm. The final balance is due tomorrow morning. Since your son just assumed a balloon mortgage he cannot pay and is currently on his way to a federal holding cell. I highly suggest you figure out how to settle this debt before the tailor sues you. You always said family handles their own obligations, so it is time for you to handle yours. Linda clutched the invoice to her chest, sobbing loudly, as the absolute reality of their immediate financial ruin washed over her. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. There was absolutely nothing left for her to say that I cared to hear. I turned away from her weeping figure and faced the crowd of wealthy guests who had spilled out of the grand ballroom to witness the spectacle. Hundreds of elite socialites were staring at me in absolute stunned silence. They had spent the entire evening listening to the Blackwell family brag and gloat, and now they were watching their absolute destruction. I looked across the sea of shocked faces and offered them a bright, perfectly polite smile. I gave a small, graceful nod, acknowledging their silent awe. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, I announced smoothly. Please enjoy the rest of the champagne. It is on the house. With that final statement, I turned my back on the entire toxic chapter of my life. I walked toward the sliding glass doors, the heavy silk of my gown flowing elegantly behind me. The cool night air welcomed me as I stepped out of the country club and descended the grand stone steps. A sleek, black luxury town car was waiting idling quietly at the curb. My personal chauffeur immediately stepped out and opened the rear door for me, respectfully bowing his head. I slid into the plush leather seat of the vehicle, letting out a long, slow breath as the heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a quiet, safe sanctuary. The chauffeur navigated the car away from the sprawling country club, leaving the flashing lights of the federal transport vehicle far behind us in the darkness. I leaned my head back against the headrest, looking out the tinted window at the passing city lights. For the first time in 7 years, my chest felt completely light. The suffocating weight of constantly trying to please a family that secretly despised me was entirely gone. I had not just survived their malicious betrayal, I had orchestrated their absolute reckoning using their own blinding greed as the ultimate weapon against them. I closed my eyes, allowing a genuine, peaceful smile to settle onto my face. The legal and financial avalanche I had triggered tonight was only the beginning of their nightmare. The natural consequences of their arrogance were about to hit them with the force of a freight train, entirely dismantling the false reality they had spent decades building. The story of their downfall would not end with one dramatic arrest at a wedding reception. It would unfold over the next several months, stripping them of everything they valued. 6 months passed since that spectacular night at the country club, bringing a brutal and methodical end to the Blackwell legacy. The justice system moves slowly, but it moves with an absolute crushing certainty when federal investigators have perfectly documented financial fraud. Carter learned this painful lesson in the most agonizing way possible. After his dramatic public arrest, the grand illusions he held about his undeniable charm and superior intelligence vanished entirely behind the cold steel bars of a county holding cell. He quickly discovered that the high-powered criminal defense attorneys he desperately needed required massive upfront retainers that he simply did not possess. Without my steady income to exploit, and with his remaining stolen funds completely frozen as active evidence in a federal investigation, he was entirely forced to rely on an overworked public defender who frankly had very little sympathy for an arrogant corporate executive caught forging his own wife's signature. The public nature of his arrest, combined with the severe ethical clauses in his employment contract, meant his logistics firm fired him before he even made bail the next morning. No reputable corporation in the city would even grant him an interview after his name became synonymous with grand larceny and federal wire fraud. To survive and pay for his basic living expenses while awaiting his federal trial, Carter was forced to take a grueling minimum wage job, working the overnight shift stocking heavy boxes at a large retail warehouse in the freezing suburbs. The man who once wore custom-tailored suits and $15,000 watches, bragging loudly about closing multi-million-dollar deals, was now wearing a stained neon safety vest and taking direct orders from shift supervisors a decade younger than him. His criminal trial date is officially set for late next month, and the ruthless federal prosecutors are highly confident he will serve significant time in a maximum security federal penitentiary. 30 days after the mediation, the $150,000 balloon payment came due. Carter could not pay it, and the bank immediately began foreclosure proceedings. Linda and Crystal tried to raise money through a public estate sale, placing handbags, jewelry, furniture, and even Crystal's wedding gifts on the front lawn. It was not enough. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their calls, the country club revoked their access, and the house was lost. They eventually moved into a small apartment far from the social circle they had spent their lives trying to impress. Without Bethany to blame or exploit, the Blackwell family finally turned on one another. While they slowly drowned in the shallow, bitter waters of their own making, I built an incredible, unstoppable empire that truly reached the very highest clouds. I am currently sitting in my sleek glass-walled office located on the 42nd floor of a premier corporate high-rise overlooking the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. The early morning sun reflects brilliantly off the surface of Lake Michigan, casting a warm golden light across my massive polished oak desk. I am not dwelling on the past. I do not spend my valuable days feeling bitter or harboring any lingering anger toward the family that tried to completely break my spirit. They are simply irrelevant data points in a massive, beautiful life I have entirely outgrown. I am currently reviewing a thick stack of new corporate acquisition files handed to me by my loyal executive team. I am surrounded by brilliant, dedicated colleagues who genuinely respect my intellect value, my strategic drive, and treat me as the visionary leader I have always been. Diana, my incredibly fierce attorney who executed the legal strike absolutely flawlessly, now proudly serves as my chief legal counsel, handling the complex daily negotiations that continue to expand my global holding company. My life is filled with profound purpose, mutual respect, and an undeniable sense of peace that can only be earned through surviving the darkest of emotional fires. I lean back in my comfortable ergonomic leather chair, picking up my favorite ceramic mug filled with dark, rich, warm coffee. I take a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the quiet warmth of the moment. I look out over the beautiful, bustling city far below, watching the tiny cars move swiftly along the gray concrete grid. I am finally completely free from the suffocating expectations of people who never understood my true worth. I am entirely unbothered by the toxic noise of the distant past, and for the very first time in my 33 years, I am in absolute total control of my own truly magnificent destiny. Looking back, the most important lesson was not that I had more money than they imagined. It was that I had spent years asking cruel people to confirm a value they were committed to denying. Their approval was never a prize. It was a leash. My silence had not made me weak, but silence alone would not have saved me. What saved me was preparation documentation and the decision to stop financing my own mistreatment. Sometimes reclaiming your life is not a dramatic act of revenge. It is simply refusing to remain useful to people who only love what they can take from you. If you have ever felt underestimated, discarded, or manipulated by people who were supposed to be your family, I want you to know that your story does not end in their shadow. You have the absolute power to rewrite your own narrative. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about healing resilience and taking back your power. Let me know in the comments below how you found the strength to walk away from a toxic situation. Remember, your worth is entirely in your own hands.